So, here's a wild thought. Can you prove something exists using just an idea? No experience, no looking through telescopes, none of that, just pure, raw logic. Well, that is the absolutely mind-bending premise behind one of the most famous arguments in all of philosophy, the ontological argument.
And this brings us to this really audacious question. Can the very concept of God actually serve as the blueprint to prove his own existence? It's a philosophical argument that tries to make this enormous leap from an idea that's just in your head directly into the real world.
So, what exactly is this intellectual puzzle? Well, at its heart, the ontological argument claims that once we correctly define or really understand what God is, we are logically forced to admit that God must exist. It's a huge claim, so let's unpack exactly how it's supposed to work.
Okay, so what makes this argument so different, so kind of weird, really, is its method. You see, most arguments for God look at the universe around us, its complexity, how it all started, and they work backward. That's called a posteriori reasoning. But the ontological argument, it does the complete opposite. It's entirely a priori, which means it relies only on reason. The proof, if it's there, is found right inside the definition itself, not out there in the cosmos.
To really get this, we've got to go way back to the 11th century, to the philosopher who first laid this all out in a classic, formal way.
Meet Anselm of Canterbury. Now, he wasn't just trying to persuade people who already believed. He was trying to build a rational proof that was so airtight that even, as he put it, a fool would have to accept it based on logic alone. And this right here, this is his masterstroke. This is the engine that drives the whole argument. He defines God not just as the greatest thing, but as the greatest thing we can possibly conceive of. A being so great, you literally cannot even imagine anything greater. You have to keep this very precise definition in mind, because every single step that comes next depends entirely on it. All right, so here's how Anselm builds his case. First, he says, look, we can all agree that this idea of a greatest conceivable being exists in our understanding, right? In our minds. Easy enough. Second, he argues that something that exists in reality is always, always greater than something that exists only in your imagination. I mean, a real perfect pizza is definitely better than one you're just dreaming about. So here's the kicker. If this greatest conceivable being existed only in our minds, then you could immediately conceive of something even greater, one that also exists in reality. And that creates a logical contradiction with the definition. The only way to solve it, he says, is that the greatest conceivable being must exist in reality. Now, of course, this logic immediately faced a brilliant critique from a fellow monk named Ganilo. He basically said, okay, Anselm, that's clever, but I can imagine a lost island, the most perfect island that could ever be conceived. So by your logic, that island must exist too. But here's the counterargument, and it's a powerful one. The perfection of an island is always contingent. You can always imagine it with more trees, more treasure. It can always be improved. But the perfection of the greatest conceivable being is totally different. Its very nature has to include necessary existence. For it to truly be the greatest, it couldn't possibly not exist. An island can always fail to exist, no matter how perfect. This being, by definition, cannot. Centuries later, though, the philosopher Immanuel Kant comes along and delivers what many people think is the knockout blow. He argued that existence isn't a quality or a predicate that adds anything to a concept. Think about it. When you say a triangle has three sides, you're describing its nature. But when you say a triangle exists, you're not adding a new feature to it. You're just saying that the concept matches up with something in the real world. For Kant, Anselm was treating existence like it was a feature, like a perfection you could just add to a definition. And Kant's big point was, you can't just define something into existence. But, you know what? The argument didn't die. It just evolved. Over the centuries, other great minds tinkered with it. Descartes argued that existence is a perfection, just as essential to God as three sides are to a triangle. Leibniz added a key step, saying, hold on, first we have to agree the whole concept is even logically possible. And then, in the 20th century, a philosopher named Plantinga gave the argument a really powerful modern update. Plantinga used something called modal logic, which is just the logic of what's possible and what's necessary. His argument is subtle. He doesn't ask you to believe God exists right off the bat. He just asks you to grant that a maximally great being is at least logically possible. Okay, if you grant that, then there must be at least one possible world, one scenario where this being exists. But here's the twist. A key quality of being maximally great is that you can't be fragile or temporary. Your greatness means you must exist necessarily. And to exist necessarily means you have to exist in all possible worlds. And if this being exists in all of them, well, then it must exist in our actual world too. All right, let's switch gears completely now. We're going to explore a different path that actually gets to a very similar idea of a necessary being, but it does it through a completely different method, the perspective that we find in the Quran. This chapter of the Quran, Al-Ikhlas, isn't really presented as a philosophical proof that's up for debate. It's more of a declaration of a self-evident reality. The whole tone isn't, let's deduce existence from a definition, but rather, this is the fundamental nature of the reality upon which everything else depends. So 2 divine attributes here are really key. The first is Al-Ahad, the unique. This implies a reality that is so singular, so one of a kind, that its existence can't be like anything else. It can't be contingent, meaning it can't depend on another cause for its being, because that would mean there's some other, greater reality it depends on, and that would totally contradict its absolute uniqueness. And this is directly linked to the second attribute, as-samad, the self-sufficient. Now, if a being depends on absolutely nothing for its existence, then its existence isn't just a property it happens to have. Existence must be its very essence. It doesn't have being, it is being. This neatly bypasses that whole Kantian debate about existence is not a predicate, by framing existence as the fundamental, undeniable nature of God. This leads to a really fundamental distinction that the Quran makes, a distinction between 2 types of reality: the reality that sustains everything else and the reality that is sustained. And this idea is perfectly captured in the divine name Al-Qayyum, the sustainer. The logic here is really intuitive. If God is the one upholding and sustaining all of creation, every star, every atom, every single moment, then he cannot himself be in need of a sustainer. It wouldn't make any sense. He has to be the uncaused, independent foundation, the necessary being that allows everything else to exist in the first place. So you see the difference here? It's huge. It's a difference in approach. The Western philosophical path tries to build this logical ladder from a definition all the way up to existence. The Quranic path, on the other hand, declares a self-evident truth about God's necessary nature and then invites people to recognize it by reflecting on the signs in the universe, its incredible order, its purpose, and its obvious dependence on a sustainer. So where does all this leave us? We have these 2 profoundly different paths, using 2 completely different toolkits to explore the same ultimate question. So, to sum it up, the philosophical journey uses pure, armchair reason to argue that the very idea of perfection logically demands existence. The Quranic path, on the other hand, presents God's necessary existence as a self-evident truth, something inherent in his nature as the unique, self-sufficient sustainer. And what's so fascinating is that despite their different methods, both of these journeys, one through the winding corridors of logic, the other through revelation, converge on the exact same idea, that at the absolute heart of reality, there must be a necessary being. And that leaves us with a final, pretty powerful question to think about. Whether you find these arguments compelling or you think they're flawed, what does it signify when 2 of humanity's most powerful tools for seeking truth, pure logic and sacred text, both independently point toward the same fundamental concept of a reality that simply must be?